NBC thought they were booking a guest. What they actually did was detonate a shift in professional basketball that nobody inside the industry was ready for. February 1st was supposed to be simple, clean, controlled. A celebration of the NBA's return to primetime glory. Madison Square Garden lit up. Lakers versus Knicks. LeBron chasing history. A network stepping back into the spotlight after decades away. The night had already been written in invisible ink. And then Caitlin Clark sat down. Not as a headline. Not as a controversy. Not even as the main attraction. Just a segment. A short pregame appearance alongside 3 Hall of Famers. That's all it was supposed to be. But within minutes, something started shifting. You could feel it before the numbers confirmed it. The energy in the studio changed. The pace changed. The balance changed. The conversation stopped orbiting legends and began orbiting her. And that wasn't part of the plan. She didn't look overwhelmed. She didn't look grateful just to be there. She didn't look like someone stepping into a room that didn't belong to her. She looked like she had been preparing for that stage her entire life. The most unsettling part? The audience reacted instantly. Phones came out. Clips started spreading. Comment sections filled up. Viewers who tuned in for LeBron were suddenly arguing about Clark's analysis. And inside network offices, executives who thought they were managing a controlled experiment began watching a live power shift unfold in real time. Because this wasn't about a viral moment. It was about authority. It was about attention. And it was about what happens when one player becomes bigger than the framework designed to contain her. But to understand why that night hit so hard, you have to understand what it was supposed to be, and how fast it slipped out of everyone's hands. Madison Square Garden was electric before the cameras even went live. You could feel it in the building, that tight New York buzz, the kind that only happens when history might unfold in front of you. The Lakers were in town, the Knicks were surging, and LeBron James, in year 22, was still rewriting record books like Time had signed a contract with him. NBC had everything lined up perfectly. This wasn't just another NBA game. It was symbolic. The network was returning to NBA coverage after years away. This was their statement, their reintroduction, their reminder that they could still own primetime basketball. The promotional machine had been running for weeks. Dramatic graphics, legacy montages, narratives about greatness, about eras colliding, about the Garden hosting another unforgettable night. And in the pregame studio sat Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, decades of combined greatness. The segment should have been comfortable, predictable, a smooth exchange of war stories and surface-level breakdowns before tip-off. Then Caitlin Clark walked into that equation. At first glance, it seemed symbolic. The rising star from the WNBA joining legends of the NBA. A bridge moment, a nod to the growth of women's basketball, a progressive inclusion. But something happened within the first few exchanges that made it clear this wasn't ceremonial. She didn't wait for her turn. She didn't defer. She didn't cushion her opinions. When spacing came up, she broke down defensive rotations with surgical clarity. When offensive rhythm was mentioned, she layered in timing adjustments that even seasoned viewers had to process twice. She spoke in sequences, anticipated counters, explained decisions before the replays caught up. There was no hesitation in her voice, no searching for validation, and the Hall of Famers noticed. You could see it in the micro-moments. A slight pause before responding. A quick nod that wasn't patronizing, it was recognition. A recalibration happening live as they realized this wasn't going to be a mentoring segment. This was a peer exchange. The conversation shifted from them guiding her to building on her points. That subtle change might not have registered to casual viewers consciously. But subconsciously, it hit, because sports audiences are trained to detect hierarchy instantly. They know when someone is being humored. They know when someone is being protected. This wasn't that. She corrected assumptions politely, expanded on veteran insights without overshadowing them, explained concepts in ways that felt simple but sharp, like she was translating advanced basketball into language anyone could grasp. And here's what made it even more disruptive. She wasn't performing. There was no exaggerated charisma, no forced television smile, no look-at-me energy. She was calm, controlled, comfortable, like she expected to be there, which is exactly what made it feel dangerous. Because when someone that young commands that kind of space naturally, it forces everyone else in the room to adjust. And the audience felt it immediately. social feeds began shifting in real time. Instead of pre-game hype around LeBron's stat chase, clips of Clark's breakdowns started circulating. Not because a producer forced them into the algorithm, but because viewers clipped them voluntarily. That's a key difference. Organic spread hits differently. Within minutes, posts weren't saying, "cool appearance." They were saying, "she sounds like she belongs here. She's better than half the analysts on TV. Why haven't we seen this before?" That wasn't part of NBC's narrative package. They had planned a respectful crossover moment. What they got was a live demonstration of media evolution. And inside the studio, even if nobody said it out loud, the energy had changed. Because once the audience decides someone belongs at the table doesn't get to vote anymore. But that was just the surface reaction. Behind the scenes, something far more consequential was happening. And the numbers were about to make it impossible to ignore. At first, it felt like a social media blip. A few viral clips. Some strong engagement. Nothing networks hadn't seen before. But inside NBC's control rooms, the dashboards were telling a very different story. Live engagement wasn't rising gradually. It spiked. Not during tip-off. Not during LeBron's first three. Not during a highlight dunk. During her analysis. Producers refresh data constantly during broadcasts. It's routine. You watch for patterns. You track drop-off rates. You monitor minute-by-minute audience retention. That night, something unusual happened. The retention line didn't dip when the segment shifted away from the Hall of Famers. It climbed. When Clark spoke longer, viewers didn't click away. They leaned in. Clips from the pregame segment began outperforming early game highlights across multiple platforms. Not by a little. By enough to make analysts double-check the back-end systems to make sure nothing was glitching. Because historically, pregame talk doesn't beat live NBA action in share velocity. It just doesn't. Unless something different is happening. And this wasn't just about curiosity. It wasn't, "oh look, that's the WNBA star." The engagement pattern showed repeat viewing behavior. People were replaying her breakdowns, quoting her explanations, debating her takes. That's not novelty traffic. That's authority traffic. Executives had seen a version of this before. During her senior year at Iowa, one of her record-breaking games had been placed behind Peacock's paywall. Critics questioned the move. Would casual fans really pay to watch women's college basketball? Subscriptions surged. Not modestly. Dramatically. That was the first internal signal that Caitlin Clark wasn't just popular. She converted attention into action. And in modern media, that is the most valuable skill in existence. Anyone can trend. Very few can convert. February 1st proved that conversion power extended beyond her playing career. It wasn't just that people wanted to watch her shoot logo threes. They wanted to hear her think. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when an athlete becomes compelling off the court, their influence stops being seasonal. It becomes continuous. Inside network strategy rooms, conversations shift quickly when that realization hits. You stop asking, "was that segment successful?" You start asking, "what happens if we build around this?" And that's when things get complicated. Because Clark's segment didn't just perform well relative to expectations. It dominated its time slot. Digital engagement heat maps showed a surge the moment she began speaking. Comment volume tripled compared to earlier studio exchanges. Short-form clips were being reshared by accounts that don't typically post basketball at all. Lifestyle pages, pop culture accounts, even finance commentators discussing marketability. That crossover signal is rare. It means the audience isn't just sports fans. It's broader culture. And once you enter broader culture, your leverage multiplies. NBC didn't manufacture that surge. There was no algorithmic push strong enough to fabricate that scale of organic spread across independent platforms. Millions of individuals made the same decision at the same time. Pay attention. That's the part institutions struggle to control. You can script a broadcast. You can script a narrative. You cannot script mass fascination. And fascination was building in real time. The most disruptive part wasn't that Clark performed well. It was that she performed naturally. There was no headline controversy driving clicks. No dramatic conflict. No polarizing outburst. Just clarity, confidence, and command. The numbers don't lie about one thing. Sustained engagement signals perceived value. Audiences were signaling value loudly. And when audiences signal value that clearly, networks adjust accordingly. But here's where the ripple effect begins. Because when one athlete's studio segment starts outperforming the actual game content, it forces uncomfortable internal questions. If she can hold attention at this level in a shared NBA space, what does that mean for the structure that has kept leagues separate? What does it mean for existing media hierarchies? What does it mean for players who've been told growth must always be collective? The analytics team could quantify the spike. They couldn't quantify the tension it created, because attention is power, and power never shifts quietly. Inside NBC, the mood wasn't panic. It was realization. They hadn't just booked a guest. They had secured a gravitational force. And gravitational forces don't orbit others for long. They pull things toward them. The data from that night would circulate in executive emails for days. Charts highlighted, comparisons drawn, strategic possibilities quietly outlined. But outside the network offices, another reaction was forming. One that wasn't celebratory. One that wasn't excited. Because while executives saw opportunity, others saw displacement. And that's where the story stops being about ratings and starts being about resistance. Not everyone was celebrating that night. While social media feeds filled with praise and NBC executives studied rising graphs with quiet satisfaction, another group was watching the same broadcast through a completely different lens. WNBA veterans, current players, league insiders, and the mood wasn't excitement. It was tension, because what unfolded on that NBC set wasn't just a strong performance. It symbolized something much bigger. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA has operated under a carefully maintained philosophy. Growth was supposed to be collective. Marketing focused on teams. Campaigns highlighted parity. The message was consistent. No one player is bigger than the league. That wasn't accidental. It was structural. The league was built in an era when individual stardom in women's basketball was treated cautiously. Too much spotlight on one player risked overshadowing the broader mission. The brand had to feel unified, balanced, controlled. Stars were celebrated, but never allowed to eclipse the whole. Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and without demanding anything, without publicly challenging anyone, she broke that equilibrium simply by existing inside it. She didn't ask to dominate coverage. Coverage chased her. She didn't campaign to be the face of the league. Fans appointed her. And when she sat at that NBC desk and commanded the conversation alongside Hall of Famers, it exposed something uncomfortable. The audience didn't see her as a WNBA representative. They saw her as a basketball authority. That difference matters. Because once viewers stop categorizing someone by league, the containment walls start cracking. For some veterans watching at home, the moment felt like confirmation of a fear that had been building since her rookie season. The fear wasn't about skill. No serious player questions her ability. The fear was about gravity. When one player pulls disproportionate attention, the ecosystem shifts. Endorsements tilt. Media coverage concentrates. Narratives revolve. And even if no one says it publicly, comparison culture intensifies. Why her? That question echoed in private conversations, in group chats, on quiet phone calls between agents and players. Not because she didn't deserve success, but because the scale of it felt unprecedented. Players who had spent years grinding in relative obscurity suddenly watched a rookie command national NBA coverage as a peer. Not as a feature story, as a voice. That kind of leap isn't gradual. It's disruptive, and disruption rarely feels fair to those who came before it. There's a difference between someone being popular and someone bending the attention economy around them. Clark bends it. That's the part that unsettles established systems. Because collective growth models rely on distribution, equal narrative oxygen, shared spotlight cycles. But attention doesn't distribute evenly in free markets. It concentrates. And when it concentrates aggressively, structures designed for balance strain under pressure. Some players publicly maintain diplomacy, supportive tweets, professional congratulations, carefully worded statements emphasizing unity. But body language in interviews, subtle tone shifts, offhand comments on podcasts. They told a more complicated story. Not resentment in its loudest form, but discomfort. Because every time Clark's name trends during NBA coverage, it reinforces a reality that challenges long-held assumptions. Fans follow individuals first, leagues second. That principle isn't new in men's sports. It's been the engine for decades. Jordan, Kobe, LeBron, Steph. But in women's basketball, the model was different. It had to be, or so everyone believed. February 1st suggested otherwise. And that suggestion landed hard. Because if one player can organically generate more crossover engagement than institutional campaigns have produced collectively, then the old model wasn't optimized for growth. It was optimized for control. That's the tension nobody wants to say out loud. Control keeps narratives manageable. Control protects hierarchy. Control ensures predictability. Star-driven chaos threatens all three. Clark doesn't need to rebel against the system. Her impact alone pressures it. And here's what made the NBC moment especially disruptive. She didn't appear as a guest representing women's basketball. She appeared as someone who transcended the label. That subtle shift changes perception permanently. Once audiences see you operating seamlessly in a larger arena, they stop mentally confining you to the smaller one. And once that mental barrier dissolves, it doesn't rebuild. For veterans who had fought for years for scraps of mainstream attention, that realization stung. Not because they didn't want growth, but because growth suddenly looked like something they couldn't influence. It was happening around them, above them, without needing their permission. And institutions notice mood shifts quickly. Agents start calling. League offices start monitoring sentiment. Sponsors start recalculating visibility metrics. Because when tension builds internally, it eventually surfaces externally. The silence after that broadcast wasn't calm. It was processing. Everyone trying to understand what had just shifted. Because deep down, even those who resisted the narrative knew something undeniable. The February 1st segment wasn't a one-off. It was a signal. And signals like that don't fade quietly. They compound. But here's where the story gets sharper. Because the real disruption wasn't popularity. It was something more dangerous. Authority. And once authority is granted by the audience, no institution can easily take it back. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say too loudly. The WNBA was not designed for one player to dominate the oxygen. From the very beginning, the league's identity centered around balance. Team-first branding, collective excellence, rotating promotional campaigns, equal narrative weight distributed across rosters. It wasn't accidental. It was strategic. In an environment where funding, sponsorship, and media space were limited, the safest model was shared visibility. No single player could be allowed to outgrow the brand itself. The league had to remain the star. Because if the league is the star, it controls the narrative. But if the player becomes the star, control shifts. And Caitlin Clark represents the first modern player to test that boundary at scale. This isn't about talent alone. There have been generational talents before her. This is about gravitational pull. Her presence doesn't just elevate games. It bends coverage. It bends conversation. It bends revenue streams. When Indiana plays on the road, arenas sell out in cities that historically struggled to draw crowds. When she appears in interviews, viewership spikes regardless of opponent. When she speaks on NBA television, digital heat maps light up. That's not balanced growth. That's concentrated demand. And concentrated demand forces a philosophical crisis. Because the collective model depends on even distribution. But markets don't care about philosophical ideals. Markets respond to magnetism. And magnetism is unfair. That's the part that frustrates people. It's not democratic inside a roster. It doesn't reward tenure. It doesn't reward seniority. It rewards impact. And Clark's impact is measurable in a way that bypasses traditional gatekeeping. No executive can argue with conversion rates. No league official can dismiss sold-out arenas. No veteran can deny engagement metrics. You can debate media narratives. You cannot debate numbers. And once numbers consistently favor one individual, structures built on equal narrative space begin to strain. Imagine you're an executive inside a league office. For years, your messaging has emphasized unity, parity, shared growth. No one bigger than the game. Then suddenly, one player drives more subscription growth, more crossover media interest, and more national conversation than any campaign you've orchestrated collectively. Do you double down on the old philosophy? Or do you adapt? That's the crossroads. And adaptation isn't simple. Because adaptation means admitting the previous structure limited potential. It means acknowledging that fans don't fall in love with systems. They fall in love with faces, moments, personalities. Jordan didn't make the NBA popular because of a collective growth strategy. The NBA grew around Jordan. The same thing happened with Kobe, with LeBron, With Steph, the league didn't shrink because those players dominated coverage. It expanded. But women's basketball historically resisted that blueprint. Not out of ignorance, out of caution. The fear was that over-reliance on one star could destabilize fragile growth. The fear was dependency. What if that star leaves? What if she gets injured? What if she overshadows others? All valid concerns. But February 1st exposed something else. It showed that suppressing star power might be costing more than embracing it, because the audience already made its decision. And audience behavior is brutally honest. They show up for who captivates them. They share what excites them. They subscribe for what feels urgent. Clark's NBC moment felt urgent. Not manufactured urgency. Organic urgency. And organic urgency is almost impossible to engineer artificially. That's why the reaction was so complex. If this were just hype, it would fade. If this were just controversy, it would cool. But this was authority meeting visibility at the same time. That combination is powerful and dangerous to static systems. There's another layer that adds to the disruption. When Clark speaks in NBA spaces and is treated as an equal analyst, it subtly reframes perception of women's basketball entirely. She isn't being introduced as a women's player offering insight. She's being treated as a basketball mind. Full stop. That reframing chips away at the invisible separation that has existed for decades. And once that separation weakens, comparison dynamics intensify. If audiences stop categorizing leagues separately in their minds, the hierarchy flattens. And flattening hierarchy creates discomfort for anyone who benefited from clearly defined boundaries. This isn't about jealousy. It's about structural identity. For years, the league could operate within a contained narrative ecosystem. Clark's rise pushes it into a broader, less controllable arena. One where attention scales faster, where debate amplifies louder, where scrutiny intensifies. And once you enter that ecosystem, there's no shrinking back quietly. The February 1st segment wasn't just a strong TV appearance. It was proof of concept. Proof that star-driven growth in women's basketball doesn't just work. It explodes. But proof creates pressure. Because now the question shifts from, is this sustainable? To, are we prepared for what this becomes? And that's where authority enters the conversation. Because popularity can be dismissed as hype. Authority cannot. And on that NBC set, something subtle but seismic happened. She wasn't being humored. She was being respected. And respect at that level rewrites rules faster than any marketing campaign ever could. There's a massive difference between being invited into a room and owning it. On February 1st, Caitlin Clark didn't just participate in an NBA broadcast. She operated inside it. That distinction is everything. When athletes from one league appear on another league's platform, there's usually a subtle dynamic at play. The tone is lighter. The questions are easier. The exchange feels ceremonial. Respectful but guarded. That didn't happen here. Carmelo Anthony didn't simplify his analysis for her. Vince Carter didn't cushion his points. Tracy McGrady didn't frame discussions in a way that positioned her as a learner. They engaged. Directly. Seriously. At times, they built on her observations instead of the other way around. And that's when the hierarchy shifted. You could see it in the micro moments. When she broke down spacing adjustments before a replay confirmed it. When she anticipated a defensive counter before it unfolded on screen. When she explained timing windows in a way that made decades of experience nod along. There was no polite overpraise. No exaggerated surprise. Just professional acknowledgement. That kind of respect isn't handed out lightly in NBA spaces. It's earned. And it's rare. Especially in real time. That's what made the moment so destabilizing. Because once someone is recognized as a peer in a larger arena, you can't easily reposition them as confined to a smaller one. It rewrites perception permanently. Think about what that means symbolically. For decades, women's basketball analysts were often treated as specialists within their own lane. Knowledgeable, yes. Skilled, absolutely. But rarely integrated seamlessly into mainstream NBA analysis without qualifiers. Clark didn't need qualifiers. She wasn't introduced as offering the women's perspective. She wasn't framed as representing her league. She was framed as someone who understands basketball at a high level. Full stop. That reframing might sound subtle. But culturally, it's seismic. Because authority dissolves invisible barriers faster than activism ever could. You can campaign for equality for years. or you can demonstrate undeniable expertise in front of millions. One of those shifts perception instantly. That night, millions watched Hall of Famers treat her as a basketball equal. Not out of courtesy, out of recognition. And recognition carries weight. When the audience witnesses that dynamic, it recalibrates their own perception. If Melo respects her analysis, if Vince nods at her breakdown, if T-Mac expands on her points, then viewers subconsciously adjust their internal hierarchy. She's no longer crossing over. She's operating across. That's different. Crossovers feel temporary. Operating across feels permanent. And permanence is what unsettles institutions. Because if Clark can sit at that desk and command authority naturally, what stops her from becoming a regular presence in NBA coverage? What stops networks from building segments around her insight instead of around legacy nostalgia? What stops sponsors from positioning her as a cross-league ambassador? Authority opens doors that popularity alone cannot. Popularity can be dismissed as hype. Authority demands inclusion. And here's where it becomes even more layered. Authority expands influence beyond the court. When an athlete becomes seen as a basketball thinker, not just a scorer or highlight machine, their leverage multiplies. Because now they shape conversations. They don't just appear in them. Clark's analysis didn't feel rehearsed. It didn't feel like someone coached her through talking points. It felt instinctual. And instinctual confidence reads differently than scripted charisma. Audiences detect authenticity fast. And authenticity is magnetic. That's why the engagement spike felt different. It wasn't just she's famous. It was she knows what she's talking about. That sentence carries massive power. Because once viewers believe you know what you're talking about, they come back. Again and again. Authority builds loyalty. And loyalty builds leverage. Inside media circles, that realization lands hard. Because networks aren't just looking for viral moments. They're looking for repeatable value. Can this person anchor segments? Can they carry analysis long-term? Can they convert casual viewers into consistent ones? February 1st suggested the answer might be yes. And if that's true, then the power dynamics across basketball media start evolving rapidly. Because authority doesn't require permission once it's validated publicly. It sustains itself. The most disruptive part? She didn't push for this role. She stepped into it naturally, which means it's not manufactured. It's scalable. And scalability is what keeps executives awake at night. If Clark becomes a consistent NBA media presence during off-seasons, if her insight becomes part of mainstream basketball discourse, if audiences begin expecting her voice in major matchups, then she's no longer just a star player. She's a basketball personality with cross-league authority. That kind of presence shifts negotiating power. With networks, with sponsors, even with her own league. Because when someone commands attention and authority simultaneously, they become difficult to contain inside traditional frameworks. And that's the part that changes everything. Popularity excites. Authority transforms. On February 1st, she crossed that line. And once crossed, it doesn't reverse. But authority is only one half of the equation. Because when authority meets corporate strategy, that's when leverage explodes. And NBC understood something before most people did. They didn't just witness a moment. They secured a future asset. Here's what most people missed in the excitement of that February broadcast. NBC wasn't surprised. They were prepared. There's a difference. To the public, it looked like a network took a creative risk. A bold booking. A crossover experiment. A fresh face in a legendary studio. But inside executive offices, this wasn't a roll of the dice. It was calculated alignment. NBC had already seen the data months earlier. During her final college season, Caitlin Clark wasn't just drawing viewers, she was moving behavior. When one of her record-breaking Iowa games was placed behind a Peacock paywall, skeptics questioned whether fans would actually subscribe. They did. In waves. That single move quietly taught NBC something extremely valuable. Clark doesn't just attract attention. She converts it into action. In media economics, that's everything. Views are good. Engagement is better. Conversion is gold. And conversion is rare. Most athletes trend. Very few turn trends into transactions. NBC understood that early. So when the NBA broadcast opportunity returned, the decision wasn't random. It was strategic. Secure the gravitational force before competitors do. Because here's how modern media wars work. You don't just compete for rights. You compete for personalities. And personalities with measurable conversion power are the most valuable assets in the ecosystem. Producer Sam Flood's public confidence wasn't promotional fluff. It reflected internal belief backed by data. She has had cameras pointed at her for years. She performs on big stages. She's thoughtful in what she says. Those aren't hopeful endorsements. They're indicators of repeatable value. NBC wasn't asking, will she handle this? They were asking, how soon can we integrate her deeper? That's a critical difference. Because when a network sees someone as expandable infrastructure rather than a feature guest, long-term strategy shifts. Imagine the internal conversations after that broadcast. The ratings spike. The digital engagement surge. The crossover social amplification. The retention metrics outperforming expectations. That's not a one-time win. That's a business signal. And business signals trigger long-term planning. Should she return for March? What about playoffs? What about a recurring off-season segment? What about exclusive digital content? What about documentary features? When numbers validate presence that strongly, the conversation stops being about inclusion. It becomes about expansion. And here's the layer that makes it even more strategic. By aligning early, NBC positions itself ahead of competitors. If Clark continues her trajectory, on the court and off, the network that built early trust becomes the natural platform for her growth. In media, loyalty often follows opportunity, and opportunity follows early recognition. NBC recognized the trajectory before it fully matured. That's not luck. That's positioning. But positioning someone like Clark comes with delicate balancing. Because once you elevate a star, you also amplify pressure. Other stakeholders notice. League offices notice. Sponsors notice. Veteran players notice. When one network begins integrating a WNBA star seamlessly into NBA coverage, it subtly shifts leverage between institutions. The WNBA historically controlled how its players were presented. Now an external platform was expanding one player's presence beyond traditional boundaries. That's where structural tension intensifies. Because once an athlete becomes bigger than a single league's ecosystem, control fragments. And fragmented control makes institutions uncomfortable. NBC didn't create Caitlin Clark. They capitalized on what already existed. That distinction matters. They didn't inflate hype artificially. They identified organic magnetism and placed it on a larger stage. And once placed there, it scaled naturally. The most telling part? They didn't overproduce her segment. They didn't frame her as controversial. They let the authority speak. That restraint signaled confidence. And confidence signals long-term commitment. In media strategy, you don't just chase moments. You invest in trajectories. February 1st wasn't about one strong broadcast. It was about testing scalability in a controlled environment. And the test passed, which leads to a bigger implication. If NBC continues expanding her presence, if other networks respond competitively, if sponsors lean heavier into cross-gender marketing, then Clark's leverage multiplies rapidly. Because leverage increases when multiple powerful entities compete for your presence. And that's when the dynamic shifts from opportunity to influence. She's no longer just reacting to coverage. She becomes someone coverage revolves around. That's a rare shift. And once it happens, it accelerates fast. But leverage doesn't grow in isolation. It reshapes negotiations. It reshapes expectations. It reshapes the power balance between athlete and institution. And that's where things get truly disruptive. Because when one player's influence expands beyond traditional league control, the entire ecosystem must recalibrate. And recalibration is rarely smooth. What happened on February 1st didn't just elevate Caitlin Clark's visibility. It expanded her leverage. And leverage is the currency that quietly reshapes entire industries. Before that night, Clark was already the most talked-about player in women's basketball. Her games were drawing record crowds. Her jersey sales were climbing. Her highlights dominated sports feeds. But those metrics lived mostly inside the WNBA ecosystem. The NBC broadcast did something different. It moved her influence into a larger arena. And once influence crosses ecosystems, its value multiplies. Here's why. In sports, leverage comes from three things: attention, authority, and independence of platform. Clark now holds all three simultaneously. Attention, because audiences consistently choose her content. Authority, because respected NBA figures validated her expertise publicly. Independence of platform, because her relevance no longer depends solely on WNBA broadcasts. That last one is critical. When a star's exposure is confined to a single league, that league controls most of the narrative. But when that star commands attention on national NBA broadcasts, when clips circulate beyond league boundaries, when fans tune in regardless of context, control becomes shared. And shared control increases negotiating power. Imagine future discussions around scheduling, broadcast placement, marketing emphasis, sponsorship alignment. If one player consistently drives disproportionate engagement, every strategic conversation shifts around that reality. Sponsors will want her front and center. Networks will want her in premium slots. Brands will want cross-league positioning. Because she doesn't just perform well. She performs predictably well. That consistency is rare. And predictability creates leverage. There's another layer most people overlook. Clark's influence isn't limited to game nights. Her presence drives off-season conversation, media appearances, podcast circuits, shoe launches, panel discussions. Once an athlete becomes culturally relevant outside competition, their value stops being seasonal. It becomes year-round. Year-round relevance shifts bargaining power dramatically. Because now the league benefits from her visibility, even when games aren't being played. That creates dependency. And dependency, even subtle, shifts balance. Here's where things get uncomfortable for traditional structures. The WNBA's long-standing messaging emphasized collective growth and shared spotlight. But when one player's cross-platform engagement dwarfs others consistently, the collective model faces pressure. Do you limit her visibility to preserve balance? Or do you amplify her to maximize growth? Either choice carries consequences. Limiting her risks, suppressing revenue potential. Amplifying her risks, intensifying internal comparisons. That's the structural tension forming beneath the surface. And NBC's move accelerated it. Because now Clark isn't just the WNBA's most marketable star. She's a cross-league media asset. That changes conversations behind closed doors. Agent negotiations evolve. Brand deals scale differently. Shoe companies reevaluate strategy. Nike already signaled long-term belief in her trajectory with a signature deal. But signature shoes are just the beginning. If her crossover presence continues expanding, that shoe stops being a women's basketball product. It becomes a basketball product. Full stop. Cross-gender marketing is where massive revenue lives. And Clark's style of play, logo range, confidence, high-drama moments, translates seamlessly into that broader lane. That's why February 1st mattered beyond ratings. It showed she can command attention in male-dominated basketball spaces without being framed as novelty. That's leverage expansion in real time. Because when sponsors see validation in broader arenas, they scale investment. When networks see sustained engagement, they increase exposure. When exposure increases, influence compounds. And compounding influence becomes extremely difficult to contain. There's also psychological leverage. Fans now associate her voice with mainstream basketball conversation. That perception shift creates expectation. Viewers will begin expecting her insight during major events. Playoffs, All-Star weekends, draft coverage. And expectation builds pressure on networks to deliver. Once the audience starts asking, why isn't she there? The decision isn't fully in institutional hands anymore. That's market-driven leverage. It's subtle at first. Then it accelerates. And when leverage accelerates, it forces recalibration across the board. Inside league offices, conversations become strategic. How do we feature her without alienating others? How do we maximize revenue while preserving locker room cohesion? How do we manage narrative concentration? Those are delicate questions. Because star-driven ecosystems are powerful, but volatile. The NBA mastered that balance decades ago. The WNBA is just now confronting it at scale. Clark didn't ask to reshape the model. But by commanding authority in broader spaces, she's naturally pulling the league toward a star-centric future. And star-centric futures concentrate influence. Once concentrated, influence doesn't easily diffuse. That's why February 1st wasn't just impressive. It was pivotal. Because leverage expanded publicly. And public leverage is the most durable kind. But leverage creates fear in systems built on control. And fear triggers resistance. Which leads to the next inevitable phase. Structural anxiety. Because when one player's rise begins exposing limitations in long-standing strategies, the response isn't always celebration. Sometimes it's protection. The fear isn't about Caitlin Clark. It's about what her rise exposes. For years, women's professional basketball operated within clearly defined boundaries. The ecosystem was stable, predictable. The pace of growth was controlled. Expansion was deliberate. There was comfort in that structure. Everyone understood their lane. Everyone understood the messaging. Everyone understood the hierarchy. Then Clark entered the picture and disrupted that equilibrium without ever publicly challenging it. That's what makes this different. She's not rebelling. She's not criticizing the league. She's not demanding special treatment. She's simply performing at a level of visibility that outpaces the framework designed to distribute it. And when one variable outgrows the system feels pressure. Here's the deeper anxiety. If one player can command more attention than entire marketing campaigns, if one athlete can cross into mainstream NBA authority spaces seamlessly, if one personality can drive subscription spikes and sold-out arenas consistently, then decades of cautious growth strategy get called into question. Not publicly, but internally, because the collective growth model was never just about fairness. It was about sustainability. It was about preventing dependency. The fear was always this. What happens if the league becomes too reliant on one star? What happens if she gets injured? What happens if she leaves? What happens if the audience only shows up for her? Those are legitimate concerns. But February 1st introduced a different reality. The audience is already choosing her. That choice didn't require institutional permission. It happened organically. And organic shifts are the hardest to counter. Structural fear builds quietly. It doesn't explode immediately. It shows up in careful language, subtle recalibrations, strategic hesitation. Inside league offices, questions become more layered. Do we build the league around her? Or protect the existing structure? Do we embrace star-driven growth fully? Or maintain philosophical balance? Do we risk accelerating change? Or attempt to manage it gradually? Because here's the paradox. Clark's rise could be the fastest path to explosive growth. But explosive growth destabilizes long-standing control mechanisms. When one athlete becomes the primary entry point for new fans, that athlete gains influence over narrative direction, influence over scheduling appeal, influence over broadcast negotiations, even influence over how the league is perceived culturally. And institutions rarely surrender narrative control comfortably, not because they're malicious, but because control equals stability. The February 1st broadcast symbolized something bigger than a crossover moment. It symbolized permeability. The invisible wall between women's basketball and mainstream NBA spaces suddenly looked thinner, and thin walls invite movement. Once audiences begin viewing women's basketball stars as basketball authorities without qualifiers, the psychological separation erodes. That erosion has ripple effects. Media debates intensify. Comparisons amplify. Scrutiny increases. And with scrutiny comes pressure. The league now stands at a fork in the road. One path embraces the star model fully. Build around Clark. Amplify her visibility aggressively. Lean into crossover media. Accept concentrated attention as growth fuel. The other path moderates expansion. Balance visibility carefully. Protect internal cohesion. Avoid over-reliance. But here's the complication. The audience already moved. And audiences rarely reverse momentum once fascination sets in. Fans from all over are attending Fever games not out of obligation, but anticipation. Broadcasters aren't featuring her because of political correctness, but performance metrics. Sponsors aren't aligning with her because of narrative pressure, but conversion power. The market has spoken loudly. And markets don't negotiate with philosophy. They respond to magnetism. That's the source of structural fear. Because magnetism disrupts predictability. It centralizes attention. It intensifies comparison. It accelerates timelines. The February 1st moment forced everyone to confront a question that had previously been hypothetical. What happens if one player becomes larger than the infrastructure designed to distribute exposure evenly? We're watching the early stages of that answer unfold. And here's the part that changes everything. This isn't a temporary spike. It's a trajectory. Clark's influence didn't plateau after college. It scaled. It didn't slow during her rookie season. It intensified. It didn't soften when she entered NBA media spaces. It expanded. That pattern suggests continuation, not correction, which means institutions can't wait this out. They have to decide how to respond. Resistance risks irrelevance. Embrace risks loss of centralized control. Neither option is comfortable. But the most important shift already happened. The audience recalibrated hierarchy. They no longer see her as confined to a single league identity. They see her as a basketball figure. That reframing is durable. And durable perception shifts rarely reverse. The structural fear isn't about collapse. It's about adaptation speed. Can institutions adapt quickly enough to harness star-driven acceleration? Or will hesitation create friction that slows collective growth? Because here's the final layer. Clark doesn't need permission anymore. The NBC moment proved that. She can operate across platforms, across audiences, across ecosystems. That independence reduces containment, and reduced containment multiplies leverage, which leads to the inevitable projection. If February 1st was just the opening move, what does the next 5 years look like? Because trajectory is where true disruption becomes undeniable. Imagine this trajectory continuing, not spiking, not fading, continuing. Caitlin Clark dominates during WNBA seasons, not just statistically, but culturally. Road games feel like traveling events. Arenas sell out in cities that once struggled to fill lower bowls. Broadcast partners quietly adjust scheduling priorities because fever games guarantee engagement. That's year one of the projection. Now layer the off-season. She appears on NBA broadcasts regularly, not as a special guest, not as a novelty, as part of the rotation. Playoff breakdowns, draft analysis, major matchups. Her voice becomes familiar in mainstream basketball discourse. Familiarity breeds expectation. Expectation breeds permanence. Now add the commercial layer. Her Nike signature line doesn't stay confined to women's basketball marketing. It expands. Cross-gender campaigns, youth leagues, international growth. Her shoes become associated with range, confidence, long-distance shooting culture. The same way Steph Curry reshaped shot selection identity. That's when branding shifts from athlete-based to era-based. Because what Clark represents stylistically aligns with the modern game. Deep range, audacity, pace, entertainment-first rhythm. That alignment makes her marketable beyond league labels. Now stretch that projection further. Her social following climbs into the tens of millions. Not just basketball fans, cultural observers. Young athletes modeling their game after her. High school players pulling up from logos because that's what they see celebrated. When play-style influence spreads downward, legacy begins forming in real time. Then comes the media layer. Documentaries, long-form interviews, cross-sport panels, global appearances. She stops being introduced solely as a WNBA star. She's introduced as one of basketball's most influential voices. That distinction matters deeply, because when influence transcends league identity, the leverage conversation ends. It becomes fact. Now imagine the negotiation dynamics 5 years from now. Networks competing for broadcast rights with her presence factored into projections. Sponsors structuring contracts around her global impact. International tours built around her draw. If that trajectory materializes, and February 1st suggests it could, the power structure inside basketball evolves permanently. Because once an athlete operates at that altitude, containment becomes irrelevant. And here's the key detail. This isn't fantasy. Every component of that projection already has early proof points. Record-breaking college ratings. Peacock conversion spikes. WNBA attendance surges. NBA broadcast authority validation. Signature shoe backing. Cultural crossover momentum. None of those signals are hypothetical. They've happened, which means the 5-year projection isn't speculation. It's extrapolation. And extrapolation makes institutions nervous. Because when trajectories become predictable, stakeholders must choose alignment or resistance. The February 1st broadcast forced that choice into visibility. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was clear. Clark proved she can command any room she enters. And when someone proves that on national television, repeatedly, perception locks in. From that point forward, the question isn't, does she belong? It becomes, how much space will she occupy? And space in media equals influence. Influence equals leverage. Leverage equals power. Which brings us to the crossroads. Women's basketball now stands at a moment that didn't exist a few years ago. A star with undeniable magnetism. An audience that responds instantly. Networks that see measurable value. Sponsors that see scalable opportunity. The February 1st broadcast wasn't a viral fluke. It was a proof of concept. Proof that a women's basketball star can command mainstream NBA authority spaces without qualifiers. Proof that attention follows excellence naturally. Proof that star-driven growth in women's sports doesn't fracture the ecosystem, it expands it. But expansion requires adaptation. The old model emphasized collective stability. The emerging model suggests concentrated magnetism can accelerate everything. The institutions must decide how quickly they're willing to evolve. Because the audience has already evolved. Fans no longer compartmentalize greatness by league. They follow who captivates them. And Clark captivates at scale. The next broadcast won't be about whether she belongs. It will measure how much ownership she's claiming. The next ratings report won't ask if it was a fluke. It will track whether momentum compounded. The next endorsement cycle won't debate potential. It will price inevitability. And that's the part that keeps executives, veterans, and traditionalists awake at night. Because once an athlete no longer needs permission to command attention, permission loses value. The February 1st takeover was quiet, professional, controlled. But its ripple effects are just beginning. The real disruption isn't loud. It's gradual, strategic, inevitable. And the story isn't over. It's accelerating. So the real question isn't whether Caitlin Clark changed basketball that night. It's this. How far will the shift go? And who adapts fast enough to benefit from it? Because the next chapter won't happen in isolation. It'll happen live. Again. And if you want to stay ahead of every move, every power shift, every ripple effect that the mainstream media won't break down this deeply, make sure you're subscribed. Because what's unfolding right now isn't just a player's rise. It's a structural evolution. And we're watching it happen in real time. The next move won't be subtle. And you won't want to miss it.